committee and then to come back to the House with a more serious and responsible bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Merci. L'honorable député aura 5.
Thank you. The honourable member will have 5 minutes for questions and comments following oral questions and the next time that the debate occurs.
Remind members, as they're coming in, to please keep the discussions very low because it is affecting the ability of members to be heard. Statements by members, déclaration de députés. The honourable member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, today is the United Nations International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. There is a series of 16 standing resolutions about Palestinian human rights at the United Nations. Since over 10 years, Canada dramatically altered its position and has voted against most of these resolutions. We need to change this. I call upon Canada to actively start engaging in finding a two-state solution. It can begin with the recognition of the sovereign state of Palestine. 138 countries, including 9 of the G20 countries, have already recognized the state of Palestine. I strongly urge Canada to join them and recognize the state of Palestine. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Tobic-Mactaquac.
Madam Speaker, as I rise again in this, the People's House, I want to express my deepest appreciation to the good people of Tobic-Mactaquac for the opportunity to represent them. As Canada's 44th Parliament begins, may we as parliamentarians commit to work together to the best position Canada for what lies ahead. May we together choose to move beyond endlessly speaking of our perils and start speaking to our potential. May we together move past the politics of pander, posturing, petulance, and pettiness towards purposeful and constructive dialogue that moves our country forward. May we embrace the strength that comes from what unites us, a unity not based on conformity, but a unity that blossoms through our diversity, including ethnicity, thought, beliefs, and so much more. We cannot build up our country by tearing it down. May we rediscover the key to Canada's comeback, which is her people, by believing in and standing up for our workers, our farmers, our entrepreneurs, seniors, and youth. We will then, once again, find the path needed to get past our current challenges. May Canada forever be...
The honourable member for Avalon.
Madam Speaker, last week the west coast of Newfoundland was hit with a record-breaking storm that saw nearly 200 millimetres of rain, causing extreme flooding. Many families have either been stranded or displaced due to the total washouts of highways, some without access to food and other essentials. I want to let everyone affected know that we are thinking of them. I want to thank our Minister of Public Safety and members of the Canadian Armed Forces for their quick response in coming to the aid of the people of Western Newfoundland in their time of need. I also want to thank rescue crews and employees at Transportation and Works. I especially want to thank the employees of Marine Atlantic in Argentia for their tireless work this past week as we try to get roads repaired, put people back in their homes and goods back on our stores. They have stepped up to take on the heavy traffic that has been displaced from the Port of Bass Ferry Terminal. I want to thank them for their dedication and for protecting our supply chain, especially at this very busy time of year. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Madam Speaker, I had the privilege of taking part last week in the Grand Cercle économique des peuples autochtones et du Québec, an economic circle with the Indigenous people in Quebec organized by the APNLQ and the Government of Quebec. I want to thank the Quebec Minister responsible for Indigenous Affairs, Ian Lafrenière, for his warm welcome. In the light of the dozens of meetings, the very inspiring meetings that I was able to take part in during this major event, I must remind the federal government that immediate action is essential in a number of areas, particularly in the area of housing. Every year in Quebec, 225 housing units are built in Quebec. The needs exceed 10,000 housing units, and this over the next 5 years only. When I say it's urgent to act, it means that the federal government must provide adequate funding for housing. Mr. Speaker, rest assured the Bloc Québécois and I will always remain allies of the First Nations and Inuit. We are listening and we are prepared to act with them.
Monsieur le Président.
Honourable Member for Glengarry Prescott Russell.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to the 16 days of action against gender-based violence. It begins on November 25th in Glengarry Prescott Russell. I want to thank the Interlude House for their hard work. We know full well that COVID-19 has posed various challenges to organizations helping women who are victims of violence. Despite this, the Interlude House has reinvented the way it helps survivors by working on their platform. This service is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for women who are experiencing violence at home. They can speak with someone by text or by calling the number available. If you know somebody who needs assistance, please share that information. To date, 1 out of 3 women will experience violence around the world. Speak out against gender-based violence. This is not just something that victims should do, but all of us.
the honourable member for Barrie-Innisfil.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sad to inform this House and indeed all Canadians that Elmore Kudanan, the patriarch and leader of the Filipino community in Central Ontario, passed away earlier this month. Elmore lived in Barrie since 1973 and founded the Bayanahan Club of Simcoe County, was a well-respected and inspirational leader in our growing Filipino community who are saddened by the loss of this great man of humility, great gentleness, wisdom, and friendship. Whether he was helping newcomers or raising funds to help the Philippines after a devastating typhoon, Elmore was always there to help, inspire, and motivate others. On behalf of myself, the member from Barrie Springwater, Oro Medonte, and Elmore's dear friend, Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown, our sincere condolences go out to Elmore's wife of 57 years, Noni, his many family and friends, and to our Filipino community in Central Ontario. Elmore was a proud Canadian, a proud Filipino, and he will be missed. Rest in peace. Ang Aming Kabigang si Elmore.
The honourable member for Mississauga East Cooksville.
Mr. Speaker, sad news. Jeff Scott, former MP who lived in my riding, passed away on August 5th in Mississauga Hospital after a short illness. Jeff was a kind and loving husband, father, and grandfather. He was larger than life and lived life to the fullest. Born on March 2nd, 1938 in Ottawa, he attended Glebe Collegiate and Carleton University studying journalism. Jeff became the first journalist to report news from Ottawa and Parliament Hill and later became the president of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. He was a master of political impressions, which he performed regularly with the National Press and Allied Workers Jazz Band. At one point, he was asked to do his impression of the Right Honourable Lester Pearson at a formal dinner here in Ottawa, and afterward, Pearson came up to him and said, "Jeff, you sound more like me than I do." In 1978, he won a by-election in Hamilton-Wentworth and became the Progressive Conservative MP for Hamilton-Wentworth for 15 years. He was famously expelled from China in 1992 for laying flowers for pro-democracy supporters. Mr. Speaker, he remained interested in politics and worked to support the campaigns of many politicians of different political stripes. We will miss you, Jeff.
The honourable member for Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, November 29, is recognized by the United Nations as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. I am proud to recognize this day as chair of Canada-Palestine Parliamentary Friendship Group, a group of nearly 50 members of Parliament and senators representing all parties working together in a shared, non-partisan commitment to peace in the Middle East and advancing the recognition and protection of human rights for the Palestinian people. Canada recognizes the Palestinian right to self-determination and supports the creation of a sovereign, independent, viable, democratic, and territorial contiguous Palestinian state as part of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace settlement. On this day of solidarity, I call on Canada to do more to help the ordinary Palestinians on the ground that live their daily lives under very difficult circumstances. We wish for a better future for all children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Brantford Brant.
I'm grateful to rise in the House today to highlight a grassroots initiative on 6 nations of the Grand River known as DO's Online Closet. November the 12th, 2010, Jewel Gawadio Montour, a beautiful and innocent young girl who endured relentless bullying, died by suicide. In an effort to honor her daughter's memory and raise awareness of the emotional and mental abuse that bullying causes, Jewel's mother, Janie Jameson, created DO's Online Closet. Named after Jewel, whose nickname was Dio, the closet was launched to provide free formal wear to underprivileged youth for special occasions such as their graduations, a milestone that Jewel sadly did not get to celebrate. Since its inception in 2012 and throughout the ongoing generous donations of clothing, Dio's Closet is a great success with a following of over 700 members. Janie Jameson has chosen to use kindness to help her heal from this unimaginable tragedy and to support others. Last week, we recognized Bullying Awareness and Prevention Week in Ontario. Today, I stand in the House to pay tribute to Jewel and ask all Canadians to join me in taking action against bullying. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to rise in this House as a representative for my riding of Mississauga, Erin Mills in this 44th Parliament. I am so proud of my team of volunteers, my family and friends who have marched with me from door to door receiving support and feedback from residents. I wouldn't be here without them, and they have my profound thanks for their faith and their dedication. My journey in politics has been in pursuit of equality of opportunity and for all Canadians, and over the past 6 years, we've continued to push that needle further towards progress, reducing poverty, taking action on climate change, building a resilient economy. My constituents have sent me to Ottawa for the 3rd time with a clear mandate to ensure affordable housing for Canadians, to be a principled champion for human rights on the world stage, to nurture a secure economy for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, I'm committed, I'm focused, and I'm ready to work to build a stronger Canada for everyone. Thank you.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to have been born in a small rural community in Hastings, Lennox and Addington. However, the reality is rural living has many challenges, and the policies of this government is making it even harder. Many people in my riding are finding it increasingly difficult to survive. Whether it's fuel, groceries, rent, or propane, inflation is hitting everything. Your family should not have to decide between feeding your family a nutritious meal, putting gas in the vehicle, or heating your home. That's right. I implore this government to focus on helping Canadians with the dramatically rising cost of everything. Mr. Speaker, it's not just inflation. It's about this government's inability or unwillingness to recognize that people are hurting and they need help now.
Yes. The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Canada is facing an economic crisis and a unity crisis. It's time for government to stop dividing, stop picking winners and losers, and be a unifying force. Canada has a wealth of oil and gas. Our energy sector contributes over 10% of our nominal GDP. We should be all proud that we provide clean, environmentally responsible energy that respects human rights. We should strive for Canadian energy independence and getting ethical Canadian oil in all of our refineries. It can be done if we stop pulling against each other and start working together. One sector doesn't have to lose for another to win. As Canadians, we should be proud of all of our industries: aerospace in Quebec, the auto sector in Ontario, fisheries in Atlantic Canada, agriculture in the prairies, forestry in BC. Elsewhere around the world, people are starved for opportunity, yet Canada is still the land of opportunity. We just need to stop tearing each other down and work together to get things done. Conservatives are ready to unite Canada and foster pride in everything this country has to offer, so let's roll up our sleeves and get to work.
The honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, each fall, steelhead angling draws visitors from around the world to the Skeena River, supporting dozens of small businesses up and down our watershed. Businesses like Babby Nor Lakes, owned by Kerry Collingwood and Billy Labonte, or the Kispiox Bear Claw Lodge, run by the Allen family. But like so many wild salmon stocks, Skeena steelhead are in trouble. This year, only 5,300 steelhead made it up our river. That's the lowest return on record. Pandemic border closures killed the 2020 steelhead season. This year, the BC government had to close the fishery due to low returns. Skeena steelhead tourism businesses need financial help, but even more, they need concerted efforts to rebuild steelhead stocks. When Thompson River steelhead took a nosedive, the minister failed to act, and now they're almost extinct. We can't allow Skeena steelhead to go the same way. I hope our new fisheries minister travels soon to the Skeena, sits down with those people who are affected, and then acts swiftly to ensure that we don't lose our steelhead forever. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to Noël du Pauvre, a Christmas fundraiser that took place last Friday in the magnificent J. Antonio Thompson Room. During the 63rd annual edition, it raised more than $735,000 to help more than 4,800 families among the poorest in Trois-Rivières and Mauricie. This fundraiser has been televised since 1959, was one of the first telethons in Canada and the oldest in North America. The idea of this televised fundraiser was that of Mr. Gilles Boulet, who gave this idea to André Audet, who owned CKTM-TV in Trois-Rivières. This fundraiser is the result of the work of more than 2,000 volunteers. It's been broadcast since 1959, as I said. And I was made by my father to watch this because he said that everybody was rich enough to give to those who are poorer than us. On behalf of the Bloc and personally, and the member for Saint-Maurice-Champlain, I want to thank this fundraiser for its unfailing commitment to help the poorest among us. Thank you.
Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the cost of everything is increasing. This government's printing of cash is unceasing. Too many dollars chasing too few goods makes life more expensive in our neighborhoods. Inflation in the throne speech with only one single mention. I'll try this rhyme to get the government's attention. Families from coast to coast are struggling. The ballooning costs of everything, they are barely juggling. Business groups are looking for the government to tap the brakes on spending. Our economic recovery is in jeopardy and the tab is never ending. Maybe they don't know, maybe they don't care. For all of this, the government has no justification. After all, Mr. Speaker, to them, this is just inflation.
Hey! The Honourable Member for York Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in my riding of York Centre, communities across Canada and around the world, Jewish families are celebrating the Festival of Lights. It's a story of resilience and triumph against oppression. This year, I'm reminded of the dedication of our community that has given up so much to love and protect the vulnerable and the elderly during these challenging times. Hanukkah teaches us never to underestimate the power of a handful of dedicated people to change the world. Inspired by faith and perseverance then, and so too today, the story of Hanukkah celebrates the faith and traditions of the Jewish people over centuries, a shining light of what freedom and diversity can and should look like in our society today. Diversity is a fact in our lives here in Canada. Inclusivity is a choice we make each and every day. It is a time to spread light and hope to everyone and to keep the Ruach, the spirit of Hanukkah, growing candle by candle each night. On behalf of all my constituents, I'd like to wish all members of this House, all Canadians, Chag Urim Sameach, Happy Hanukkah.
Oral questions, question orale. The Honourable Member for Portage-Liscar.
Of everything go up, while the Liberals have been denying that their policies would cause inflation. However, by the end of last week, the Finance Minister was calling inflation a crisis. She just doesn't think the Liberals are responsible for it. It's almost like she's printing money so that she never runs out of bucks to pass. But, Mr. Speaker, if the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister believe that this is a crisis, what is she prepared to do to deal with it?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite would have Canadians believe that inflation is a made-in-Canada problem. But experts agree that this is an international challenge that all of our peer countries are facing too. In fact, last week, even the leader of the opposition admitted that rising inflation is, quote, a global phenomenon. So I have a question to offer for the member opposite. Who is the real voice of economic policy for the Conservatives? The leader of the opposition, or the deputy leader, or maybe the member for Carleton?
Honourable member for Portage-Lisker.
Finance Minister back to a meeting that she had just this Friday with Canada's most senior economists, that maybe she wants to ask them some questions and take their advice. Most of them agreed this government is making the inflation problem worse. In fact, BMO chief economist Doug Porter said, I think at the margin, there are some things fiscal policy can do. Fiscal policy, that's the federal government's responsibility. And that's basically to take the foot off the accelerator. So, Mr. Speaker, what that economist was saying is the government is contributing to the crisis. So take responsibility, and what are they going to do?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to quote another economist I respect very much, and I think Stephen Harper respected him too, because Prime Minister Harper appointed him to be Governor of the Bank of Canada. Stephen Pelosi was asked in a weekend TV show whether he thought Canadian government spending was the cause of inflation. He was unequivocal. His answer was, I think that's not right. He's right. The Conservatives are wrong.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisker.
What the finance minister is saying then, that this government has absolutely no control and have no ability to deal with inflation in this country.
Yikes.
That is a big F right off the start, a fail for this government. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe the chief economists and experts in this country, what is the government going to do? Will they at least admit that they're in government? They should have an answer for inflation. Are they going to do anything or just throw up their hands and say, not our problem, too bad everybody, keep paying high costs because the Liberals don't care?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me quote Governor Pelosi, an economist respected by all Canadians, further. He was asked whether the support we offered at the height of the COVID recession was the right thing to do. I quote, what the stimulus did was to keep the economy from going into a deep hole in which we would have experienced persistent deflation. Read a book or two about the Great Depression in the 1930s and realize what was averted when we went through this. We know we did the right thing. Let me quote the governor and urge the Conservatives to read a book or two and understand that.
L'honorable député de Richmond-Arthabasca.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabasca. Mr. Speaker, our entrepreneurs, our job creators are at the end of the rope. In April and June, I personally wrote to the Ministry of Immigration to propose solutions in order to help businesses that are having real trouble finding labor. It's been more than 7 months, Mr. Speaker, and nothing has changed. Nothing has been done to fix this problem. When will the Prime Minister finally get to work and come up with some concrete solutions to help address this labor shortage that is facing all of our Canadian businesses? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. On this side of the House, we believe that immigration creates jobs and long-term prosperity. That is why we are working together with the Government of Quebec. We have already delivered the goods. This year we have hit an historic target of temporary foreign workers, and we will continue to work hard. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabasca. Mr. Speaker, the Minister can say whatever he wants, but on the official website of Immigration Canada, it states that there is a processing backlog. It is clearly stated that they are currently dealing with the request from 2019. We're almost in 2022, Mr. Speaker. Businesses need help now. They need help in order to deal with a labor shortage now. When will this government get to work and come up with concrete solutions? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about words. We've taken action. We have hit historic immigration levels, not just in Quebec, but throughout Canada. That's good for the economy, it's good for our country's long-term prosperity, and we will continue to work closely with all of the provinces, including Quebec. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the Environment Commissioner panned the Liberals' record on climate change. Since the Liberals came to power, the Commissioner has said that Canada is the G7 country with the worst performance. Imagine that. And yet somehow still today, the government is subsidizing oil companies so that they can increase their production, but hopefully in a less polluting way. Wow. Mr. Speaker, once again, they're trying to put out a fire with a flamethrower. Will this government finally realize that we need to cap the production of fossil fuels? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I will just interrupt the Minister. I will just ask him to wait a moment.
Order. Okay, je vais demander au ministre de recommencer.
All right, I will ask the Minister to start again, because I wasn't able to hear his answer clearly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. And I'd like to invite him to closely read the Environment Commissioner's report. In it, it is clear that his analysis is about the years prior to the arrival of our government in power. As the Commissioner stated clearly, that our various measures in 2016 and 2020 were not studied in the report. The hundreds of billions of dollars that we have invested, Mr. Speaker, over the past several years. I am looking forward to seeing the Environment Commissioner's next report, which hopefully will deal with the measures that we have brought in to reduce pollution in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, this government has increased its emissions since 2015, so I have no lessons to learn from the Minister. And if the government's plan were so good, the fossil fuel sector wouldn't be celebrating. And yet, on Tuesday, the Canadian Association of Energy Contractors announced happily that no fewer than 1,363 new wells would be drilled in 2022. That's 25% more than this year. They are getting out the champagne, Mr. Speaker. And that all has happened barely 2 weeks after COP26. Could this government at least tell the industry that 1,363 new wells is a very bad idea? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to remind my colleague that we already have one of the highest carbon prices in the world. We have passed Quebec, California. We will pass Europe in 2022. We also have some of the highest targets for reducing methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. And in addition, we have decided to cap greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector, which is something that no other oil-producing country has done so far. Thank you.
Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, no one is protected from COVID-19 until everyone is protected. Yes. The Omicron variant makes this clear. For months, health experts, the WHO, and New Democrats urged this government to ensure vaccines are available around the world. This is not just for equity reasons, but because it's essential to keep Canadians safe from new COVID variants. Not only did Liberals ignore this advice, they opposed developing countries manufacturing vaccines for their own citizens. Will the Liberals stop defending Big Pharma and start protecting Canadians?
Yes. The Honourable Minister for International Development.
The COVID-19 pandemic does not recognize borders and will only be overcome through coordinated global action. We've been very clear from the start, no one is safe until everyone is. We committed to donate the equivalent of at least 200 million COVID-19 vaccine doses to the COVAX facility by the end of 22, Mr. Speaker. We have committed over $2.6 billion global COVID-19 response since February 2020, and we made an additional $1 billion available for the International Monetary Fund and related loans. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister for the Honourable Member for Churchill, Kiwetinoong-Aski.
Monsieur le Président, l'émergence de nouveaux variants de la COVID.
Mr. Speaker, the emergence of new COVID variants is a serious reminder of the fact that this virus can still become more dangerous. The solution is to ensure that the entire planet is vaccinated. Canada can help, but it is prioritizing the needs of Big Pharma. We even have a Canadian company that is ready to export vaccines, and yet the government is preventing that. When will the Liberals suspend these rules in order to help the entire world fight the pandemic? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for her important question. As you know, Mr. Speaker, and colleagues in this House know, from the beginning, we have strongly defended fair access to COVID vaccines throughout the world. We have assisted through the COVAX program, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to support our international partners in order to resolve potential obstacles. We are also working within the Ottawa Group, an initiative to help countries throughout the world be able to access the vaccines. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work hard to help vaccines reach all citizens throughout the world.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
27-year-old Jose of Greeley called me on Friday from his parents' basement. I see Liberals laughing about that. He can't afford a home. He has a job, the same job his mother had, in fact, but while her family could afford a 2-acre lot and a nice property to raise the kids, he can't even afford a condo. He wanted to know why during COVID, while wages were down and immigration was next to zero, house prices rose under this Liberal minister by 22%. Can she tell Jose why, according to Bloomberg, Canada has the second worst housing bubble in the world?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me talk about some of the very specific ways our government is helping Canadians with the very real challenge of affordability. A single parent with 2 children will receive $13,600 from the Canada Child Benefit. The average family in Saskatchewan will get almost $1,000 from their carbon price rebate. Seniors received an extra $500 this summer. A student will save more than $3,000 through our plan to eliminate federal interest on student and apprentice loans.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, the problem for Jose is he actually can't start a family without a house. And he can't get a house because under this minister, housing prices are up 20%, led by increases in land prices. You can't blame land prices on supply chains because land doesn't have supply chains, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that we have the second biggest land mass in the world, and yet the second biggest housing bubble on planet Earth, with only New Zealand, an island in the South Pacific, having more expensive housing. So again, can this minister please explain why under her short tenure as finance minister, housing prices are up 22%?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is very rich for the Honourable Member to talk about housing. When he was in office, they invested just $250 million a year on affordable housing.
I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Minister. I'm having a hard time hearing him. I'm going to ask him to start right from the start again so I can hear the whole answer coming out. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to put our record on affordable housing against the Conservative record any day. They spent $250 million a year for every year that they were in office on affordable housing. In contrast, we have invested over $27 billion as part of the National Housing Strategy. We intend to move forward on a Housing Accelerator Fund, which will work with municipalities to create more affordable housing and more housing supply. We are the government that introduced the first-time homebuyer incentive to enable more Canadians to have access to the dream of home ownership. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Carleton.
So his defense on housing is that not only are homes more expensive under this government than they were under the previous Conservatives, the programming is now 100 times more expensive so now it's more expensive for home buyers and for taxpayers. But I noticed the Minister of Finance was too afraid to get up and answer a question about house price inflation that she has caused. I was specifically asking about the 20% increase in both land prices and housing prices since she took her job. She can't pass the buck to another minister or to another country. When will she explain why house prices have risen so much?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad that we're spending some time today talking about the Canadian economy. And as Finance Minister, let me point out what is the single most important economic policy in Canada today. And that, as the emergence of a new variant on Friday has reminded us, is the fight against COVID. It is not over, and the single most important tool in our toolbox is vaccination. So I'd like to urge the Conservatives to get on board and help us end this COVID pandemic.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly why on Friday our first 5 questions were about this important issue. But there is another important issue that affects all Canadian families and is particularly brutal for middle-class families, and that is the precipitous increase in the cost of living. We're talking 4% more for food, 6% more for personal care products, 10% more for transportation, and a high increase as well when it comes to housing. Does this government have a plan for inflation? Does this government realize that it is its policies that are causing the most vulnerable among us to pay so much more? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government has taken action to help families with the cost of living. One of the first things we did was to increase the children's benefit. We took action to reduce childcare costs.
How important it is to make sure that we're there for families, and we're going to continue to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Louis.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, former StatsCan economic analyst director Philip Cross stated that this government is responsible for the inflation situation. He said in the Financial Post that this government's decisions have contributed to increasing inflation. The government must work hard to eliminate the deficit. If not, it will increase pressure on interest rates. What will this government do instead of ignoring the problem? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member across the way wants Canadians to believe that inflation is a made-in-Canada problem, but Canadians know that this is a problem that is occurring throughout the world. In fact, no later than last week, the leader of the opposition acknowledged that this is a global phenomenon. So I have my own question for the Conservative member. Who is the Conservative Party's economic decision maker? The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Well, pretty soon, the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister will have her chance to ask questions. In 2 years, when she's finished her book and she finds herself on the opposition benches. I would like to remind this House that many other countries in the G7 are facing lower levels of inflation than we have here in Canada because this government hasn't done anything to reduce inflation. What will this government do to help Canadians who are facing the scourge of inflation? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I know that Canadians understand that inflation is a global phenomenon, just as the Leader of the Opposition does. Here are some numbers that will confirm that. Canadian inflation is at 4.7. In the US, 6.2. In Mexico, also 6.2. New Zealand, 4.9. The G20 average is 4.6%. Those are the numbers. Those are the facts. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, Quebec and Montreal are facing a criminal gang war that is being fed by weapons smuggling at the border. The only way to solve this is for the federal government to take action at the border. Smugglers are smuggling these weapons in places where there are multiple jurisdictions that overlap, specifically in order to increase government confusion. So the Bloc Québécois is proposing that we create a joint squad against weapons smuggling with Quebec provincial, Indigenous, and American police forces all working together. Will this government take the lead, just as we are proposing, and immediately create such a squad? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, each life that is lost due to illegal weapons is one life too many that is lost, and we will take action against this weapons smuggling. And we brought in a record number of illegal weapons last year. We have also created a joint forum with the U.S. in order to fight firearms violence. We will continue to work hard with all of our partners, including the government of Quebec, in order to fight firearms violence. The Honourable Member for Avignon, Amitis-Matane, Matapédia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I asked the Minister if he would commit to taking action at the border in order to fight weapons smuggling. He said, yes, absolutely. I believe that's exactly what he said. Today, the Bloc Québécois is proposing that a joint squad be created. That is an approach that has already worked when it comes to tobacco and narcotic smuggling. As I said earlier, the Minister has committed to take strong action against weapons smuggling. Will the Minister create this squad that we are proposing? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that we need to take further action in this area in order to fight firearms violence. That is why we are going to take further action against the types of weapons that are used as weapons of war. We are going to create more programs and take more measures, and as well as investing more resources in order to find concrete solutions, along with my colleague, the Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, it's no longer time for just more negotiations, because firearms violence is already terrorizing neighborhoods and leaving many victims in Montreal. What the Bloc Québécois is proposing is not a working group, more discussions with the Americans, information sharing between police forces, none of that. We need a joint force with various different police services involved who will work together full-time on the ground against border weapons smugglers. Will this minister take advantage of the Bloc Québécois' invitation and take action? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will be there to take action. And we are very glad that the Bloc Québécois is showing an interest in taking measures to reduce gang violence in our communities. We announced major investment in this area in Budget 2018 for our border services and law enforcement agencies in order to better detect and address smuggling, weapons smuggling. But the Bloc Québécois voted against that, Mr. Speaker. And when we announced investments in the provinces and territories for the same area, well, we'll see what will be done, but we will continue to take action in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the fall of Kabul, fewer than 4,000 of our Afghan partners have arrived in Canada. Afghans were standing shoulder to shoulder with our armed forces on the ground, putting their lives on the line to help us.
Yes, they were.
These partners are now desperate to flee the brutality of the Taliban. Why does this government not care about the promises made to our allies? Can the government explain why the safety, security, and resettlement of our Afghan partners is not a priority?
Great question.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by standing in solidarity with those Afghans who supported the Canadian mission while we were there. And that is the reason why we introduced a special immigration measures program that allowed us to resettle approximately 4,000 Afghan refugees, despite the very challenging circumstances which remain on the ground as a result of the Taliban. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we also introduced a humanitarian resettlement program which will resettle 40,000 Afghan refugees, focusing on women, on girls, on targeted minorities, and that is work that I hope that all members in this chamber will support because it is the right thing to do.
The honourable member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The situation in Afghanistan is devastating. Religious minorities, women's rights leaders, and democratic activists continue to hide, labeled as enemies of the Taliban. Afghan interpreters who stood alongside our Canadian forces and their families continue to be hunted and targeted. After almost 120 days since Kabul fell, less than 4,000 refugees have been rescued, and a data breach exposed hundreds of refugees' names. When is this government going to get their responsibilities seriously and evacuate those people that are in so much harm?
Well, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I assure my colleague and all members in this chamber that this government is taking that responsibility seriously every day. That is why we took the challenging decision to send back our Canadian Armed Forces, and why, thanks to their brave and courageous performance, we were able to evacuate approximately 4,000 despite the very challenging circumstances. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to deliver on our humanitarian goals, which we doubled from 20,000 to 40,000, so that we can continue to provide a bright future for those who are most targeted by the Taliban, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Liberal government pats themselves on the back for abandoning people that serve Canada. Afghan interpreters and other persecuted religious minority groups are still receiving no support from this government. While this Prime Minister called a selfish election and abandoned those who served Canada and Afghanistan, veterans and NGOs stepped up and are helping refugees escape. The Minister is also throwing these partners under the bus, stating they're acting too slow. Why would anyone want to serve Canada ever again when all this inept Liberal government will do is abandon them?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you who this government is patting on the back. We're patting the veterans who helped support our humanitarian efforts. We're patting the backs of the Canadian Armed Forces who helped us evacuate approximately 4,000 despite the very challenging situation in Kabul. And Mr. Speaker, we are patting on the back the Afghan Canadian diaspora who has stepped up day and night, 24/7, to provide humanitarian support for the Afghan families who have already arrived in Canada. And Mr. Speaker, we will continue to do that work proudly with all of them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last week Campaign 2000 released a report that showed that 40% of children in Winnipeg Centre live in poverty. Now, instead of addressing high poverty rates, this government is clawing back benefits from low-income families, causing food and housing insecurity. The Liberals didn't claw back pandemic supports from rich corporations who paid out dividends and bonuses to their wealthy shareholders. So why, Mr. Speaker, is this government cutting CCB payments from the lowest income families in Manitoba?
The honourable minister.
And I share my colleague's concern because it's important for this government to make sure that we are supporting the lowest income, particularly families across this country. We know that families in particular have been impacted by unpredictable added expenses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why through the CCB, we are providing additional payments this year to help families through this difficult time. Families are receiving up to $1,200 per child under the age of 6, with the first payment of up to $600 made last May. This will benefit about 1.6 million Canadian families and about 2.1 million children under the age of 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
In Vancouver, nearly 40% of the unhoused are Indigenous peoples. For the last 4 years, this Liberal government has claimed that they're working on a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. So far, there has been no progress, and they didn't even bother to mention it in this throne speech. This glaring omission is a disgrace, and given the urgent need and their promise of reconciliation. So it is time for the Liberals to be honest. Is a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy no longer a priority for this Prime Minister?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, every Canadian deserves a safe and affordable place to call home. Since we came into office, we've helped over 1 million families get the housing that they need, but we absolutely agree that there is more work to be done. We are committed to Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned urban and rural and northern Indigenous housing strategy. This week's throne speech outlines our government's continued commitment to making housing more affordable by bringing in a $4 billion housing accelerator fund, ending chronic homelessness, and a rent-to-own program to help renters become owners. There is more work to be done, but there's a lot of progress that has already been achieved as well, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vimy. Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, our healthcare workers were on the front lines keeping Canadians safe. However, as they continue to do their jobs, they've all too often become the victims of intimidation and threats. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Justice explain what we are doing to protect healthcare workers?
Ministre de la Justice.
The Honourable Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first off, I want to thank the member for Vimy for her question. I'd like to begin my answer by thanking all healthcare workers. It's their effort and their sacrifices that are getting us through this pandemic. They should never be subjected to violence and intimidation. That's why we want to amend the criminal code to put in place tough consequences for this type of behavior. I hope that I can count on the support of all members of this House to get Bill C-3 passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Prince George Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government continues to assure Canadians that negotiating a new softwood lumber agreement with the U.S. is a priority. Yet, just a few months ago, the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai was quoted in Reuters as saying, "In order to have an agreement and in order to have a negotiation, you need to have a partner." And thus far, the Canadians have not expressed an interest in engaging. And now the U.S. has announced that it will go ahead with doubling the softwood lumber duties on Canadian producers. Why won't this government come to the table and just get the deal done?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for that question. I've had an opportunity to speak to the U.S. Trade Representative, in fact, on many occasions. And absolutely, softwood lumber, the forestry sector, its workers are a priority for this government. We will always stand up for this sector. We are very disappointed at the duties that have been and the tariffs that have been leveled to us. We're going to continue to work with the American administration so that we can defend Canada's softwood industry.
The Honourable Député de Chicoutimi.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the relationship between the U.S. and Canada seems to be a one-way street. The further increase in softwood lumber tariffs will have serious impacts on Canadian jobs. While Canadians are already struggling with inflation due to the pandemic. Either you get results or you make excuses. When is the Prime Minister going to stop coming back empty-handed every time he meets with the American president?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's forestry sector supports tens of thousands of jobs for middle-class Canadians in communities across the country. These duties are unjustified and they harm forestry sectors and workers in both of our countries. We will continue to defend Canadian lumber workers. Canada has always been recognized as a fair trading partner, and I will continue to raise this issue at every possible opportunity.
Number 4, Prince Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During question period last week, the Honourable Minister of International Trade told the House that she raised the issue of softwood lumber with the U.S. Trade Representative. Yet, as you've heard previously in questions, the response in the STR is quite different. Regardless, it sounds like the Ambassador Tai is ready to negotiate. So can the Minister tell us how many actual negotiations, not photo ops, but negotiations on softwood lumber have taken place since Ambassador Tai's statement in May?
Good question.
Oh, bravo. Minister of International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, thank you to the Honourable Member for this question. I know how important this is to him, to all of us. We absolutely want an outcome that is acceptable to the Canadian industry and to the workers. We are working with the Canadian lumber industry. They're going to be the ones to provide us with the negotiated mandate on this issue. I will continue to work closely with Canada, and together we're going to continue taking a Team Canada approach because that's what works.
The honourable member for Calgary, Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I think that's code for zero negotiated. So after 6 years of inaction, countless job loss, doubling of tariffs in spite of a WTO positive ruling on our behalf, last week the finance minister said that she was finally considering retaliatory tariffs against the Americans on the softwood lumber dispute issue. However, she's provided no details on what those measures would be, and we just heard that they really haven't met with the Americans to do anything about it. So my question is this. As President Biden did last week when he doubled the tariffs, are Canada softwood lumber workers correct in calling the finance minister's bluff on the fact that there are no details around the retaliatory measures?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Canada's softwood lumber workers know, and indeed what workers in all sectors of the Canadian economy know, is that our government can be relied on to defend the national interest in trade disputes with the United States. By contrast, they also know that when the going gets tough, the Conservatives believe in folding their tent. And we know that because that is what the Leader of the Opposition said when it came to the 232 tariffs and when he urged us to drop our retaliation.
The Honourable Member for La Pointe-de-Ville. Mr. Speaker, the Montreal Airport Authority has decided to attack the French language pilot training schools by raising the rates for the use of the Mirabel Airport facilities by 7,000%. This is expropriating the schools by other means, and it's an attempt to get the Francophone students to leave. Once again, a federally regulated corporation is showing itself indifferent to the future of the French language. Will the new Minister of Official Languages intervene with the Airport Authority to ensure the survival of French language pilot training? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the Prime Minister for having given me the responsibility for this file, official languages, which is something I care about very much. I am also the first Acadian person to hold this role. As a Francophone who lives in a minority language community, I understand these issues, and I understand how important French is in Quebec and outside of Quebec. That's why we'll be moving forward with the modernization of the Official Languages Act, which is a top priority for this government. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, while Vancouver charges only 20% of the full fee to flight schools, the Montreal Airport Authority charges the full fee to schools that train pilots in French in my riding of Mirabel. We're talking about increasing the annual fees per plane from $540 to $38,000. This is an exorbitant increase, and it's also an expropriation by other means. We don't want to see this play out again, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister of Transport personally commit to ensuring that these Francophone flight schools will be allowed to continue? The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for his question. French is a very important language. Our government is working on protecting French in Quebec and all across Canada. We will work with our colleagues here in the House of Commons to ensure that our Official Language Act is upheld, is reformed, and we support all Canadians who want to work in either official language.
The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, for years we have been saying that the Liberals are all talk, no action on climate change, and now we have proof. The Environmental Commissioner has confirmed that this government has been a total failure on reducing emissions. Wow. Canada is #1 in emissions in the G7. Is this minister proud of being #1?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would invite my honourable colleague to actually read the report from the Commissioner to the Environment and Sustainable Development, which clearly shows that he did not look at the measures we've deployed since 2016 to fight climate change in Canada. In fact, his report points out that under the Harper government, there was nothing done on climate change in Canada. The commissioner acknowledges that he didn't look at the 100 measures that we've put in place since 2016, the $100 billion that we've invested to fight climate change in this country, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, they're number one in the G7 on emissions and number one in this place for blaming others for their lack of action. Now, this government has declared war on the oil and gas sector, and despite that, emissions are continuing to rise. They pick fights, make enemies, kill jobs, but still emissions don't decline. So if it isn't to lower emissions, why is this government so focused on ending Canada's energy sector?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would actually point out to my colleague that in the last inventory, Canada's greenhouse gas inventory actually shows that without our government action and thanks to the inheritance from the Harper government on climate change, emissions in 2030 would be 30 million tons higher than they would have been without our intervention. That's almost half of the emissions of all of Quebec, Mr. Speaker. So our plan is working and we will continue on with implementing it. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Industrial parks in Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier are full of companies with help wanted signs. Companies are having to cut back on production, cancel orders, or in the worst case scenario, close their doors. Foreign workers are one of the solutions to this labor shortage. So here's a quick and easy solution. Put dedicated teams in place to unclog the system, increase staff at the Ministry of Immigration. Will the minister commit to reducing delays now so that we can save our businesses and help them participate in the economic recovery? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for his question. In 2021, more than 21,000 qualified workers are already in Quebec. We will meet our thresholds. And if Quebec really wants to reduce delays, why not tackle the true cause, which has to do with Quebec's immigration targets?
Hans.
Mr. Speaker, we all know how important the small businesses are to our Canadian economy. It's the bedrock, and that's why our government was there since day one of this pandemic, through the wage subsidy, through the rent subsidy, through the extension of the Canadian Emergency Business Account. But as we head into Christmas, I'm thinking of my retailers in Kings Hants, small businesses, those that are on the main streets of Windsor, Wolfville, and Kentville, and I'm wondering if the government, the Minister of Small Business, can provide an update to this House on the measures the government is supporting small businesses, particularly retailers, as we head into the Christmas holiday. Thank you.
Honourable Minister.
I want to thank the member for Kings Hants for that really important question. And to small businesses all across the country, thank you so much for your incredible resilience during what was a terribly difficult time. But what I've also seen during this period are businesses that have gone digital, businesses and entrepreneurs that have been even more entrepreneurial, and what we're doing is we're making a $4 billion investment to help more businesses across the country to go digital, so that your wonderful Main Street store can offer those services and those products digitally. But as we head into the holiday season, I would encourage everyone, shop local.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, the cost of living continues to rise while this Liberal government continues to spend. According to the Vice President of Scotiabank, inflation is expected to rise above 5% by the end of the year. At this rate, Canadians cannot afford to have this Liberal government continue to pour expensive gasoline on their inflationary fire. If the government doesn't plan to increase Canadians' wages by 5%, then what will they do to ensure my constituents can feed their families?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me quote another economist who I hold in very high regard, and I know that Prime Minister Harper did too, because he appointed him to be Governor of the Bank of Canada. Stephen Pelosi said over the weekend what the stimulus did was to keep the economy from going into a deep hole in which we would have experienced persistent deflation. Read a book or two about the Great Depression in the 1930s and realize what was averted when we went through this. Mr. Speaker, we know on this side of the House we did the right thing, and it's time for the members opposite to admit it.
The honourable member for Medicine Hat, Carson Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether the Finance Minister is aware that Mr. Harper hasn't been here for 6 years. Scotiabank's Rebecca Young has warned that the Liberal stimulus promises will drive up inflation and hurt our recovery rather than help it. Ms. Young knows what she's talking about. She used to be the Director of Policy Development at Finance Canada. Our Prime Minister says that he never thinks about monetary policy. Well, it's about time someone in his government did, because Canadians are hurting. When will the government provide a plan to cut costs and reduce inflation, or will they continue to ignore the struggles of Canadians?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it's time for the Conservatives to be honest with Canadians. Do they really believe that it was wrong to support businesses and families when COVID hit? Do they really believe that the COVID lockdowns were the time for austerity? Canadians know that supporting them during COVID was the right thing to do. And you know what? They know better than to trust the Conservatives to have their backs during the crisis, but they can trust us.
The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, an elderly couple visited my office recently to explain that CPP and OAS wasn't enough to cover the rising cost of living caused by inflation. They are being forced to choose between food and rent. Also trying to balance medical, dental, prescription expenses. CPP and OAS are not coming close to keeping up with hyperinflation. Mr. Speaker, when will the government stop their inflationary policies that devastate the budgets of seniors?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
So, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Conservatives to be careful and thoughtful with use of economic terminology. 4.7% inflation is high, but it is not hyperinflation. And also, Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind the member for Medicine Hat that the government is responsible for fiscal policy, but it is our Bank of Canada that is in charge of monetary policy. We are very concerned, Mr. Speaker, about our seniors, and that is why our government has acted to support them.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Madawaska-Restigouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New Brunswick has always been a great destination for tourists from Canada and across the world. Tourism is vital to the province's economy. It generates over $1 billion in revenue every year and employs over 27,000 people. But this sector is facing incredible challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Could the Honourable Minister of Tourism and the Associate Minister of Finance update this House on the most recent efforts made by the federal government to support the tourism sector in the Atlantic? The Honourable Minister of Tourism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for Madawaska-Restigouche for this question and for his hard work on behalf of the people of New Brunswick. Our message to tourism operators is clear. We're here for you now, and we will continue to work with you to help get the economy moving again in the weeks and months to come. Thanks to the Regional Recovery Assistance Fund, we've provided more than $225 million to Atlantic Canadian businesses who are facing difficult times. We've protected more than 16,000 jobs and supported nearly 2,500 businesses. We are here for the sector, Mr. Speaker, and we always will be.
Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, a year and a half into this pandemic and public transit is still struggling. Without help, transit systems across Canada are going to have to cut services and lay off workers. Canadians need more transit, not less. And last week, FCM once again called for federal help for transit operations. Now is not the time for pointing fingers at provincial governments. Will this minister renew help for public transit operations?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question, and
Quite the contrary. The last thing we would do is point the finger at municipal or provincial partners with whom we have worked collaboratively to make historic investments in public transit. It's good for the quality of life for people who live in our cities. It's obviously good for our collective fight against climate change. I had an excellent meeting with the board of directors of the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, and I'm committed to working with them and all Canadians to enhance access to transit right across the country.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development released a scathing report reminding us, quote, Canada was once a leader in the fight against climate change. However, after a series of missed opportunities, it has become the worst performer of all G7 nations since 2015. This report revealed the government has funded 40 projects via a $675 million emissions reduction fund without verifiable emission reductions, and 2/3 of projects going towards increasing oil and gas production. Can the minister confirm whether this funding program will be suspended with the remaining funds reallocated towards verifiable emission reductions going forwards?
The honourable minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the honourable colleague for the question. We welcome the report from the Commissioner, and while we agree with a number of the Commissioner's observations with regard to the structuring of ongoing programming, I think it's important to remember that this particular program was intended to be a temporary COVID response measure to sustain jobs for workers and communities at a time of record low and at times negative energy prices, and to ensure continued action on methane pollution reduction. And then this program reduced to date about 4.6 megatons of methane. That being said, the worst of the pandemic is behind the oil sector with respect to profitability and cash flow, and in that light, we have commenced a review of the program and its.
That's all the time we have today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons. We have a point of order, the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, during question period, the Minister for the Environment responded to a question. He wasn't in this House physically. He was here by virtual Parliament. So he was present here through virtual Parliament. Now, we have a rule in this House. I believe it's a rule that has been consistently applied, that props are not to be used by those of us speaking in this House. Wherever he was, virtually, he was in some kind of a room, and in the back, right behind him, was hanging on the wall a bicycle. Now, presumably trying to make a statement about his environmental cred. That's right. But, Mr. Speaker, the point is, there is a rule that you cannot do indirectly what you cannot do directly. What the minister has done is blatantly used a prop, because he's now doing it from the safety of some other room, perhaps his office, his basement. So I would ask you to rule on this. I believe it's an abuse of the traditions of this House.
Going to the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Speaker, I
is rising on a point of order.
Stand dumbfounded. Only a Conservative could see a bicycle as a partisan symbol.
I'm not sure that was a point of order. I just want to take this opportunity to remind the honourable members that what is a prop is really perception by everyone who's watching. So what I'm asking all members, order. What I'm asking all members, whether in the House or coming in virtually, try to make your background as neutral as possible. L'honorable député de Bécancour-Nicolet.
The honourable member for Bécancour-Nicolet. On the same point of order, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the minister wanted to show us that he couldn't be here because he had a flat tire on his bicycle. That was not a point of order either.
Going to get on with business. Tabling of documents. Introduction of government bills. Mr. Lametti, seconded by Ms. Ian, moves that for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Criminal Code, Conversion Therapy. This motion is deemed adopted. Mr. Lametti, seconded by Ms. Ian, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
This bill, premier lecture de ce projet de loi.
When shall this bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House. Déclaration de ministre.
Statements by ministers.
Rapport de délégation interparlementaire. Présentation de rapport de comité.
Presenting reports from committees.
Introduction of private members' bill.